Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Making a Killing, the podcast from Hudson Institute's Kleptocracy initiative on how corruption is reshaping global politics. Today, I'll be taking you to a country that is very much on the front line of the struggle against global kleptocracy, and that is Ukraine. I'll be talking to Daria Kaleniuk, who is the executive director of the Anticorruption Action Center in Kyiv, one of the leading civil society organizations engaged in the fight against corruption and the power of the oligarchs in that country. After that, I'll be diving a little further into some of the issues that Daria and I talk about and some of the other big news developments from the past couple of weeks with Casey, Michel and Paul Massaro. If you're enjoying Making a Killing, please make sure to subscribe, share it with your friends, and if you're feeling generous, I'd really appreciate a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. It really helps get the word around. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Daria. Hello, I'm joined today by Daria Kaleniuk, who is Executive Director of the Anticorruption Action Center, also known as ANTAC, which is a major civil society organization pushing for anti-corruption reform in Ukraine. They're an incredibly effective and I must say very brave group of people, and I've personally found their work incredibly informative and inspiring in the short time that I've been working on kleptocracy issues. So Daria, welcome to Making a Killing, and I'm really delighted and honoured you can join today.
I'm honoured to join your podcast.
A place that seems sensible to start, in case the audience isn't overly familiar with recent developments in Ukraine, is back in 2014 when Ukrainians undertook major protests and ousted Viktor Yanukovych, who was a deeply corrupt president with close ties to the Kremlin. Indeed, he's now hiding in Russia. So I guess could you start by explaining that was a very sort of hopeful period after the Revolution of Dignity, and what were some of the sort of major, important and very innovative anti-corruption reforms that Ukraine introduced during that time that you look back on now and think were particularly interesting?
Well, we've done quite a lot of things which are unique even worldwide. So first of all, there were opened information about who owns what in Ukraine. By that, I mean we have introduced legislation and then implemented it, which requires to have access information to the public procurement. And as a result, we have one of the most comprehensive, transparent public procurement system, ProZorro, which is actually award-winning system. We have opened registries about real estate, so it's easy to put the address in Ukraine and see who is the owner of that address. And we were actually first country to introduce mandatory disclosure of beneficial ownership of companies. The legislation was adopted back in 2014 and then implemented in 2015. And
this is to confront the problem of money laundering through shell companies. People have to disclose who really owns these companies. And Ukraine was actually, as you say, the first one in the world to do that.
Yeah, and now the US is going to do that. But
that's right, yeah.
But this information will not be public yet. But at least there will be that.
Not yet, yeah. We've got a way to go with that.
Yeah, so at least somewhere we are at first and at the head of the US. And one more thing where we are ahead of the US and even Europe is the asset disclosure system for public officials. Mm-hmm. Ukraine has electronic system of submitting asset declarations, and in these asset declarations, public officials disclose all assets they own and their immediate family members own, including hard cash, expensive movable property, including companies they own or beneficially own, so which they ultimately control, and including even the names of the banks where they hold their accounts. And this is tremendous source for information for civil society to expose corruption. So as a result of this direction of anti-corruption work, Ukraine became a very transparent country, and it became very easy to identify fraud and corruption. So it made our lives, the lives of investigative journalists, civil society activists, easier in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
However, it probably created the feeling in society that there is more corruption than it was before under Yanukovych. So it was kind of the result which we didn't expect. The perception of corruption actually increased. And another part of important anti-corruption reform was focused on building institutions, state independent institutions, which could use this information to hold untouchable people in Ukraine, those politicians, oligarchs, accountable. Basically, there was created the anti-corruption infrastructure, such kind of agencies, National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, the investigative body with powers to investigate top corruption, then Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office with guarantees of their independence and with powers to bring these cases to court, and even high anti-corruption court. Ukraine is a country which inherited a very dishonest and corrupt judicial system. Yes, so under 80 years of the totalitarian rule, there was no tradition of truly fair and independent court system in Ukraine. We were part of the Soviet Union. And unfortunately, within the last 30 years of independence, we didn't manage to build the true independent judicial system. However, we have some success story in the example of the High Anti-Corruption Court. And this is the court where judges were selected by the special commission composed of foreign experts, including even the UK former judge, who interviewed candidates to High Anti-Corruption Court, and based on their law integrity and law professionalism, they could ban bad, rotten candidates from entering the new court. And this worked.
Which is quite unusual, isn't it? I mean, countries don't usually let judges from other countries help select their own judges to enforce their own laws. So that's such a huge innovation on Ukraine's part.
It
is a very
innovation,
interesting idea.
But it's not when we are asking foreign judges to come to Ukraine and enforce our laws. This is the point. The point where we want foreign experts to come is the selection process, where there can be people with absolute immunity to external influence. So basically, they didn't make their career here in Ukraine. They didn't owe anybody anything here in Ukraine. Their future career doesn't depend on anybody in Ukraine. So basically, absolutely independent from Ukraine people with high integrity and with high professionalism. And when these people are interviewing candidates to judges, then this can be, trusted procedure. And this procedure proved to be effective in the case of Ukraine. And I believe it could be effective also in other countries which are undergoing such kind of transition from autocracy to democracy, where the most hard part of the reforms is actually the judicial reform. How to reform the third branch of power, executive, judicial, legislative, right? So there has to be some sort of independence to the judiciary. However, what to do with the judiciary if it is corrupt, if we have independent, corrupt judiciary branch of power? That's a very important question. We are trying to find the answer right now in Ukraine.
Well, that leads us to sort of the next question, because I wanted to start off with some of the sort of the good news and the innovation and the energy that comes out of Ukraine in terms of fighting corruption, because I think it is an amazing, the work that your organization does and others like NABU, people like that are just an inspiration to everyone else. So I wanted to start off with the sort of good news, but we do also need to talk about some of the obstacles that you face, and particularly in the past few years, there's been some backsliding on some of those interesting reforms that you talked about just now. So I guess the next question would be, Ukraine continues to struggle a great deal with endemic and systemic corruption. What are some of the main and enduring obstacles to reform in the country, in your view? And I guess if you could also talk about, just personally, what sort of obstacles and dangers even do you and your colleagues face as civil society activists against corruption?
Well, to put it brief, our task for the last few years is to protect these developments and protect anti-corruption tools and institutions we have built right after the Revolution of Dignity. And the enemies of this reform are very powerful. They are both internal enemies and external enemies. By internal, I mean oligarchs, which are still thriving in Ukraine, which raised themselves into the real power after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They made big money out of absorbing the state property, violating rules, and sometimes violating criminal laws. So these are super powerful people who usually control certain politicians, certain ministers, and certain judges and prosecutors. So they
and the media as well, right? The media, which is very powerful and important as well. Yeah,
absolutely. They operate like in a full circle. So basically, they use media and they use hard cash, which they receive as a result of corruption, to invest into political projects. And sometimes they create their own political parties. Sometimes they just invest in the politicians. Sometimes they buy MPs. And then when they enter into the parliament, they can influence who will be the next prime minister, who will be the minister, and what kind of contracts with the state their companies will have. And basically, very often these are monopolies, which are not producing added value, but are just siphoning away money from the taxpayers and very often laundering this money outside of Ukraine. And part of the money which is not laundered is being reinvested again into the new political cycle, into media and into political parties. So these are internal enemies which oppose the anti-corruption and judicial reform in Ukraine. But I think that we would cope with them if we didn't have also external enemies. And the external enemy is Kremlin. Is the Russian Federation, which is autonomy and which is challenging the entire idea of liberal democracy, and which is using strategic corruption as a geopolitical tool to control their neighbors and penetrate already developed countries in the West, which are thriving with democracy, and basically using strategic corruption to challenge these countries and their success story of democracy. And for Kremlin, it is suicidal to observe the success story of democracy in Ukraine. Because Kremlin treats Ukraine as part of their empire. You know, Russian empire still exists. So therefore, they are, they have still a big network of agents, former spies, KGB agents. Sometimes these are, already famous businessmen in Ukraine. Sometimes these people are even in the parliament. And this network of people controlled from Kremlin and getting resources from Kremlin is trying to destroy all effective anti-corruption independent institutions and tools. So that's why it's so hard for us to resist attacks on anti-corruption reforms and to push for the new progress.
So the counterbalance to the Kremlin's support for corrupt elements in Ukraine is that Ukraine also has a very important relationship with the United States and international donors like the IMF, who can exert political pressure on Ukrainian politicians to introduce anti-corruption reforms which would limit the Kremlin's ability to infiltrate Ukraine. So I guess over the past few years, so that has been very, very important in the past, that they back up, as Ukrainians, your efforts to reform your own country, that they provide that support. They're not interfering directly, but they do hold the government to account, and they say, you're not going to get this funding this loan unless you introduce this anti-corruption court, because we're not convinced that the money just won't be stolen, right? If we lend it to you. In the past few years, though, under the Trump administration, Ukraine found itself in a kind of a difficult situation, as it found itself kind of at the center of a big US, basically domestic political scandal that was sort of orchestrated by the president and his supporters, Rudy Giuliani, and so on. And I've taken an interest in Ukraine for years because I work on anti-corruption stuff. But it was strange to see mainstream US newspapers having stuff about Ukrainian corruption on their front pages, and how that was used and abused by politicians here in the US for their own ends, which was sometimes quite unpleasant and quite disgusting, frankly, because Ukraine is a very important but also a vulnerable ally to the US. Bearing in mind the importance of external support from the US and its partners for corruption reforms in Ukraine, how did that change in the approach from the US administration affect anti-corruption reforms during the past few years?
That were hard years. And I would like to emphasize that the Trump phone call, which triggered the impeachment trial, happened right after our presidential elections, when a very new person appeared as a leader of the nation. It's President Volodymyr Zelensky, who haven't been in the politics before. He won the elections promising fighting corruption and promising to challenge existing political elites in Ukraine. And Ukrainians were willing to have the change. He was a comedian before, who played at his show an average teacher who accidentally becomes president. And the name of the comedy show was The Servant of the People. So he named his real party The Servant of the People, and under this slogan, he won the presidential elections. So we didn't know what to expect from President Zelensky, but he definitely was very new in the politics, and especially in geopolitics. And obviously, when he was elected, he wanted to have a phone call with American president, and he got it. And in the first phone call, he received such a harsh treatment. Usually, as I understand, in such phone calls, America would like to support rule of law, independent prosecutorial institutions, independent judiciary institutions. But from the readout of that call, I see that it was quite to the contrary. Obviously, I think that President Zelensky was kind of freaked out, and he probably thought that this is how
understandable.
this is how real politics, geopolitics works, and I think this significantly harmed the soft power of the U.S. and entire West in helping Ukraine and Ukrainian leadership to drive for reforms. So that was important moment, when the new person came into power in Ukraine, very unexperienced, and immediately he was dragged into this impeachment scandal with President Trump. However, I also think, and I have, I'm observing this case from the very beginning. I know how it was evolving. I was even part of that because our organization was blamed in this, within impeachment hearings, we were blamed for allegedly, stealing American taxpayers' money. However, I believe that all that case is an excellent example of strategic corruption. And recently, just late summer 2020, the US government imposed sanctions of one of the implementers of this strategic corruption operation, Andriy Derkach. And the US government went public with saying that this person is the active Kremlin agent in Ukraine. And he was preparing for a long time this operation. So basically there was an entire plot of people inside Ukraine, outside of Ukraine, in the US, and probably Kremlin, who were trying to simply throw Ukraine under the tram, because realizing that we are in the top news in the US, positioned as the most corrupt country in the world, is not helpful at all for the country, which is already occupied by Russia and is trying to build rule of law. And basically, we were kind of a ball used between different political players in the US. And now I feel that it's even toxic to talk about Ukraine among certain high-level politicians. And it's very unfair to say that Ukraine is the most corrupt country in the world. Actually, if we were the most corrupt country in the world, no one would know that. Because we do not have asset disclosure system or public procurement system where you can actually, from the US, come, open it up and see what is wrong in Ukraine, who is corrupt, and actually then stop cooperating with such person or impose sanctions. So basically, I think that it was really harmful, but I hope that now with the new administration, the things will change.
Well, that brings us to an important point, which is sort of recent developments the past few weeks, really since the Biden administration came in. You've seen President Zelensky has been acting quite different, from at least my perspective as an outsider. He seems a lot more confident in pushing some of the anti-corruption reforms since President Biden assumed office. President Biden, of course, was Obama's point man on Ukraine back in the day, and he was very forceful about fighting corruption in Ukraine in his statements when he was vice president before. But we've seen a pretty solid indication of what the new administration's approach will be in the past week, because they issued a travel ban. The State Department issued its own kind of sanction, which is a travel ban on one of the most important oligarchs in Ukraine, who is Ihor Kolomoisky. He's also under a pretty extensive criminal investigation here in the US and in other countries for alleged money laundering. So I wonder if you could just explain a bit about who Ihor Kolomoisky is, what the kind of scheme that he's alleged to have run with private bankers, and what role he plays in Ukrainian politics. Why is this such a significant move to place a travel ban on him?
Ihor Kolomoisky is one of top 5 oligarchs in Ukraine. He owned the largest bank called Privatbank until 2016. In 2016, the Ukrainian government decided to nationalize this bank. And the reason was the bank was absolutely bankrupt. What Kolomoisky was doing with his bank, he was using it as a money-making machine. Basically, he was taking money from the state, stabilization loans, which Ukrainian state in turn received from IMF. And then Kolomoisky would launder this money outside of his bank, issuing loans to related parties. And then these related parties would bankrupt and loans would never be returned. But the money trail would lead you to Cyprus, to UK, and to the US. Right.
Cleveland, right? He bought all these skyscrapers in downtown Cleveland. It was a really strange situation. There was a Ukrainian oligarch was the major landowner in a major US city.
Yes, in Cleveland.
But yeah, it's just one example of many, but yeah.
A few other factories, steel factories in the US, offices in Florida. So all that are the basically money of Ukrainian taxpayers, but also American taxpayers. Because it is the United States, which is the largest donor of IMF, and IMF loans came to Ukraine actually to help our economy. But then money went to to Privatbank to prevent the failure of the big bank. It's the largest bank of the country. So if the bank would have failed, entire economy would have failed. It was too big to fail. All half of the businesses of the country would have collapsed and panic. There could be panic. So therefore, the only solution was to nationalize the bank. And now the National Anticorruption Bureau of Ukraine, this new agency we have created after the Revolution of Dignity, is investigating private bank case, and FBI is investigating this case. As far as I know, there is also investigation, at least in Switzerland and Israel. There are also civil cases in UK and in the US. So lots of going on regarding these stolen assets, which I believe have to be recovered back to Ukraine.
And it's not pocket money. It's, I think, it's around $5.5 billion was the sort of black hole in private banks finances
at least
when it was nationalized.
At least $5 billion US. Yeah, and it's huge money for Ukraine, because now we are waiting for the next tranche from IMF, which is about $1 billion US dollars. So it's huge money.
No, it goes a huge way, doesn't it? With that in mind, Kolomoisky, he's this very colourful character. He's very prominent in Ukrainian politics. He's now accused of being at the centre of what will be, if the allegations are true, and he stole over $5 billion. That's the biggest money laundering case in history. It's even bigger than the 1MDB scandal from Malaysia. So what do you think what practically? But I mean, Kolomoisky presumably isn't flying over to the US all the time, right? So for listeners who are thinking, well, what use is a travel ban on Ihor Kolomoisky? What is the practical effect, though, of the US taking this action and naming Kolomoisky in this way?
I think that it is extraordinary move of the US government to make this visa ban public. Mm-hmm. We know that State Department frequently imposes visa bans for certain officials, but it's usually done non-publicly. Mm-hmm. Another interesting thing in this case is that it's not only Ihor Kolomoisky who was visa banned. It was his wife, his daughter, and his son. And until recently, his son was studying in the U.S. in Cleveland and playing in basketball team in Cleveland. As I understand, he was not very successful basketball player. And just about a year ago, Ihor Kolomoisky took his son back from the U.S. To Ukraine. And Ihor Kolomoisky himself, he was residing for a while in Israel, but then he moved to Ukraine. I think he is afraid of extradition to the U.S. Therefore, he's trying to stay in Ukraine and influence on Ukrainian corrupt judges and prosecutors, and influence on the Ukrainian policy using his members of parliament who he still controls. So that's the goal of Ihor Kolomoisky. Why I think this visa ban, this public visa ban, with a special statement from State Secretary Antony Blinken is important. It sends a clear message to Kolomoisky that the US sees this person as a very destructive individual to the idea of democracy, to the idea of rule of law, not only in Ukraine. I think that they see oligarch Kolomoisky as a threat to development, and he's a vivid example of oligarch which embezzles money of taxpayers, uses this money into various political enterprises, and impacts what are the policies of the state. I think this is an important message to all oligarchs like Ihor Kolomoisky, which are in almost every post-Soviet country and in Kremlin as well. So therefore, the impact of this public visa ban is very important. It's also important for those Ukrainian businessmen, judges, prosecutors, and members of parliament who cooperate still with Ihor Kolomoisky, because they could be next under the radar of American personal sanctions or other reactions. I think this significantly limits the ability of Ihor Kolomoisky to continue his destructive activities.
That's great. And I mean, it's aside from the messaging and the kind of warning shot across the bows of other would-be oligarchs and corrupt officials and so on, there's as an anti-money laundering nerd, there's a practical side, which is banks and financial institutions around the world his name is now in all their algorithms. That will be flagged as a suspicious person. They can't really. They'll have to really, they'll have to report him as a suspicious customer to their respective treasuries if he tries to do business with them or
Absolutely.
any of his companies. Practically moving his money around will likely become a bit more difficult for him as well. But we're coming to sort of the end of our time here, so it's been really fascinating. So we covered, we had this hopeful period after 2014. Ukraine introduced some of the most innovative and interesting and energetic anti-corruption reforms in the world. We've talked about how Ukraine has struggled to implement some of those a bit in the intervening period, not helped perhaps by mixed messages from the US and other partners at various times under the Trump administration. And now with the new Biden administration and kind of newly confident President Zelensky sort of pushing anti-corruption reforms a bit more, what are your sort of hopes for the future of Ukraine at this point? How do you think the next few years will go for your work in terms of pushing back against corruption? And in particular, if you could comment on how the US and Europe and other international partners, what can they do to support Ukraine on its journey towards a less corrupt future?
Well, I have lots of hopes on the US. US has much more powerful sanctions instruments. And these personal sanctions instruments of the US, they really work. I hope that something like a public visa ban for oligarch Ihor Kolomoisky will continue regarding other oligarchs, which are doing destructive activities in Ukraine and attacking rule of law, anti-corruption reforms. The same should work for other top officials who are not oligarchs, but let's say high-level judges, parliamentarians, members of government or even presidential administration, but who are sabotaging their reforms and who are helping crooks to launder money, embezzle taxpayers' money, and attack existing anti-corruption institutions in Ukraine. So this would be the most helpful support from the US to Ukraine. And another support, which is crucially important, is the soft power of the US. When there is high-level communication between senior US leadership with senior Ukraine leadership, and the US leadership expresses support for the rule of law, not like we, seen during the last phone call, that encourages I think President Zelensky and other people in Ukrainian government to make unpopular reforms and painful reforms even for them. We still have to remember that Ukraine is occupied by Russia. Significant part of our territory is occupied, and the war is going on. Every day, literally almost every day, soldiers are dying because of the military forces of Russian Federation are present in the eastern part of Ukraine. So in order to fight that war, and in parallel to that, cleaning up our institutions and corruption and investigate crooks, we need high-level support from key partners. And the US is obviously our key partner. EU is also an important partner, but there are too many. There are 28. It's hard for them to agree upon something like Nord Stream 2. The pipeline from Russia to Germany, bypassing Ukraine, which we think is a very corrupt, very good example of geopolitical strategic corruption, and we highly opposed to this pipeline. But for the US, it is much more easier. You don't have to consult with 28 countries. And US jurisdiction, American dollars, they are being used by everyone. Cutting a certain oligarch to excess of the US dollars through correspondent banking account, it's possible to do from the US if there is a desire there to do that.
Well, that's great. And that kind of brings us to all we have time for today, unfortunately, Daria. But thank you for that thoughtful final comment. Thank you for joining me today. Is there anything else you wanted to mention just before we leave, or any final thoughts?
Well, I want to mention that Ukraine is probably the most promising country to produce positive results of democracy and fight with corruption. And if we synergize efforts and achieve these irreversible changes, it will be like domino effect in entire region. So if you want to change Russia and stop its autocratic imperialistic ambitions worldwide, just help us to make Ukraine successful. Their ideological construction for the big Russia, for the third Rome, as they call the Russian Federation, will collapse immediately. Russian people will want the same change. And we see on the example of Alexei Navalny that there are more and more Russian people, new generation of Russian citizens, who don't believe into the regime of autocracy and who want to live in a decent, normal country which protects their citizens.
That's great. Thank you so much, Daria. Well, thank you again for joining us today. And please do keep up the good work. Stay safe and let's keep in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting. It was a lovely story.
I'm back with, as every week, Paul Massaro from the US Helsinki Commission and Casey Michel, the journalist and author, to discuss some of the biggest developments in the world of transnational corruption and global kleptocracy from the past couple of weeks. Guys, I've just finished speaking with Daria Kaleniuk of the Anticorruption Action Center in Ukraine, well known to you both, I imagine. We talked a little bit about the action that the US State Department took against the Ukrainian oligarch Ihor Kolomoisky in the past week, this travel ban that he's been placed under, which I wanted to dive a little deeper into what that means and what Kolomoisky himself is accused of doing. Because as I mentioned on the call with Daria, if the allegations against him are true, he may well be implicated in the largest money laundering scheme of all time, bigger than 1MDB or anything like that. So I wonder, Casey, I hope it's not, betraying a confidence or anything to say that Kolomoisky's case is highlighted in your book. So you've done a lot of sort of digging around. You know about what this guy's been up to. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the way in which I talked to Daria about his activities in Ukraine, but I wonder if you could expand a bit on what he has been doing stateside and in other countries around the world, because of course this is a transnational phenomenon. So a Ukrainian oligarch isn't necessarily just causing problems in Ukraine.
Yeah, Nate, that's a great point and a great question. And, I think just at the outset, it is worth noting that it is difficult to overstate just how momentous, just how important, and just how much of a signifier the U.S.'s decision to slap this 701c3 ban, effectively sanctioning Kolomoisky, is, how much of a relative surprise it was, given just how powerful Kolomoisky has been and continues to be in Ukraine, and just what a sign it is for all range of post-Soviet oligarchs and, frankly, oligarchic figures outside of the region itself is moving forward, and how much more credence it gives to the current administration's claims of and rhetoric around combating these kinds of transnational kleptocrats. I mean, I think it's worth just taking a step back and examining Kolomoisky himself. Again, so much of what is in the public sphere pertaining to Kolomoisky, these are allegations. So much of this is waiting to be proven in court, but these allegations are coming from the Ukrainian government, the American government, and a number of other prosecutors in a number of other jurisdictions. Now, the question for Kolomoisky was, okay, you have $5.5 billion. What are you going to do with it? You can't just keep it in your own personal account. You can't just keep it in your wallet. You can't just bury it in the backyard. Where can you park it? Where can you put it? Where can you keep it and stash it and keep it safe, trusting that nobody would be looking there either? If nobody's looking at the actual supply side or the actual origination of the funds themselves, that is to say, nobody's looking at the bank's internal workings, where can you also go that nobody's going to be looking where you park it? Lo and behold, for Kolomoisky, that place, that jurisdiction, just so happened to be, time and again, the United States of America. And this is part of a far larger story of the U.S.'s transformation into this financial secrecy haven, into this offshoring mecca that any number of oligarchs, corrupt figures, arms dealers, narco traffickers, wildlife poachers, et cetera, anybody with a bit of dirty money is going to be parking their money in the U.S. But what we've seen that makes the Kolomoisky story unique is not just the magnitude, again, $5.5 billion Ponzi scheme. It's that he also wasn't just parking that money in places that we traditionally associate with kleptocracy. He wasn't going to the Miamis of the world. He wasn't going to the New Yorks of the world. He wasn't going to the Malibus or the Los Angeleses of the world. He, along with a number of American enablers, took that money and parked it in places that he thought nobody was ever going to look. And these are places like Cleveland, Ohio, a mid-major American city that's on the decline, that had any number of assets up for sale, that was just waiting for somebody to come in with deep pockets and talk a big game or talk the right game about revitalization, about bringing jobs back, about creating a brand new city. Nobody wanted to look this gift horse in the mouth. And what ended up happening over the course of a few years in the late 2000s, the early 2010s, is that Kolomoisky and his team became the largest commercial real estate holders in this mid-major American city, in all of Cleveland, Ohio. He effectively became the commercial landlord of this entire American city that, again, nobody associates with kleptocracy. Nobody associates with transnational money laundering. But I think it's worth noting he didn't stop there. Okay, he purchased hundreds of millions of dollars worth of real estate in Cleveland, but he also went to small towns, steel towns, factory towns, all across the American Midwest, all across the American Rust Belt, in places like Pennsylvania, in places like Kentucky, in places like West Virginia, in places like Illinois, even in Texas. He was spreading his money. He was spreading this pilfered loot to all these jurisdictions that didn't have any other investment anywhere else coming in. And what you saw time and again is all these local officials, all these local factory owners, all these local forces realizing that all of a sudden there is this windfall of cash coming in to purchase these assets, with people such as Kolomoisky and his enablers saying, we're going to bring the jobs back. We're going to bring the heart of this small town, the heart of this small factory town, the heart of this small steel town back. It's going to beat once more. And middle America, Rust Belt America, the Midwest can thrive yet again. And as we saw again, time and again, that rhetoric, those purchases were not followed by any of the promised investment, any of the promised job creation, any of the promised revitalization. Instead, Kolomoisky and his team effectively let these places go to rot. So just to pick one example of the many that exist, there's one small town called Harvard, Illinois, that has a massive 1.5 million square foot factory plant that can be, and was once supposed to be, the economic lifeblood of this small town in, quite literally, middle America. Kolomoisky's team came in, they purchased the massive factory itself, they discussed how they were going to bring jobs back, they discussed how they were going to revitalize the economy. Lo and behold, nothing happened. Lo and behold, the building has slowly been going to rot. And lo and behold, here we are in 2021. In the next year or two, this building, this 1.5 million square foot factory, is going to effectively implode. It's going to need to be demolished because the money that would be required to put back in and revitalize the place isn't going to be coming from Kolomoisky. It's not going to be coming from the city. It's not going to be coming from anyone. And all of a sudden, this great promise of a factory and this windfall of cash is now an albatross around the neck of an entire town in middle America. And that's just one story of the many, many, many we have seen connected to Kolomoisky, connected to his team, and connected to this $5.5 billion Ponzi scheme over which Kolomoisky has now been sanctioned by the U.S.
No, that's great, Casey. And it's often a bit of a struggle, this sort of very technical issue that can seem rather abstract, transnational corruption. What does that have to do with ordinary Americans? Well, there you go. You can get a better case study. Paul, this has come up a few times now. I wonder if you could just explain quickly what a 7031C action is. Many of our viewers, they'll think about sanctions, they'll think about asset freezes, but the State Department has its own tools, doesn't it, for dealing with these kinds of issues?
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to just add one thing, I guess, to what Casey was saying, which was an excellent explanation about how kleptocracy comes into roost. And that is kind of the question of, okay, So now we have one case where we know that dirty money led to essentially what was the downfall of an American city and what was around it, and that this commercial real estate was in. How many Midwestern downtowns, how many American cities, how much commercial real estate is owned by these people? I mean, how many transnational kleptocrats own the United States? It's just, we don't know. I mean, we don't know. And it's extraordinary that we don't know, you know? I mean, it's so I mean, we have every reason to believe that this is not a one-off, that Kolomoisky is not an isolated case, but that in fact, there are Chinese kleptocrats, other Russian kleptocrats, other Eurasian kleptocrats, and so on and so forth, perhaps Saudi kleptocrats that own huge swaths of the United States. So this is just something to keep in mind as we talk about this. Casey, I see you want to jump in on that.
Kolomoisky is very much, to Paul's excellent point, Kolomoisky is very much the kleptocratic canary in the coal mine that we have right now. We should absolutely expect more of this in the future.
Yeah. So I just wanted to lay that out because it worries me. I mean, if one thing keeps me awake at night, it is how deeply entrenched is this already? You know. So to 7031C, Nate, it's an excellent question, and I really think that 7031C is one of these unbelievably unsung authorities. I wish it had like a sexier name than 7031C. I sometimes just refer to it as a public visa ban because it's important to sort of recognize that visa bans are one of the really key ways that the United States can extract behavioral change / punish / kind of express, like signal all sorts of ways to kind of say you're not allowed in our country, which, you know, of course, is completely to the discretion of the president, that it's not something that has to go through some huge legal process or anything. But in 7031C's case, it takes it a step further in that you can actually do this publicly, which according to the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is the sort of overarching piece of legislation that governs all visas in the United States and visa bans and all entrance to the United States, the Immigration and Nationality Act stipulates specifically that visas are confidential, that visa adjudications are confidential. So what the 7031C allows the Secretary of State to do is designate an individual for involved in corruption or human rights abuse. And this is in fact a shall authority. So this is not the Secretary of State may, the Secretary of State must, you know, if the Secretary of State has credible information that this individual is involved in corruption or human rights abuse, must ban them from the United States. Okay, they must not necessarily ban them publicly. The public piece is permissive, but they must ban them, which is, you know, really very interesting. The history of 703(1)(c) did not include this. So 703(1)(c) has been around since 2008. Originally, it was a may authority, and it was kind of just a here's the authority. Of course, you know, the INA in some sense allows for this already. Again, like the INA has an extremely flexible adjudications thing. Visa adjudications can be made for almost any reason. There's even sort of a catch-all on like sort of foreign policy reasons. You're not allowed in the United States, it's done. But what's really extraordinary about 703(1)(c) is this public piece. And everyone, I think, is more familiar with Global Magnitsky. And Global Magnitsky, of course, are the targeted sanctions, economic sanctions that are on sort of the specially designated nationals list. By definition, must be public because that's how the private sector knows to enforce them. And they are blocking of assets, right? It's assumed that people that get hit with Global Magnitsky are also banned because the legislation states that Global Magnitsky allows for visa bans. But we don't know this for certain in most cases because the visa bans are actually private still. They're still the confidentiality requirement. Now, sometimes we'll GloMag you and then we'll also 703(1)(c) you. And then if you want to really get the triple crown, we'll also indict you. That's sort of the triple crown of kleptocracy, I believe, like Golnara.
Then you're already in trouble.
But in this particular case, this was a 703(1)(c) designation, a public 703(1)(c) designation, which it's really important to note that this type of designation really carries the weight, very closely carries the weight of a Global Magnitsky sanction. It doesn't quite, because Global Magnitsky includes the possibility of enforcement actions, but just the way that banks work and the way that, you know, anybody that does customer due diligence, which isn't everybody, but anybody that does customer due diligence and that sort of thing works, is they're going to worry about the risk of taking on an individual that has been publicly banned from the United States. And I think we have every reason to expect further action against Kolomoisky. I'll just note that Kolomoisky and Firtash, another Ukrainian oligarch who is currently awaiting extradition in Austria, these individuals would not be the first Ukrainian oligarchs tried and even convicted in the United States. If you go all the way back to Lazarenko, the former prime minister of Ukraine, who is now sitting in a jail cell in the United States for money laundering and fraud. So, I mean, this is sort of something that can happen, and I think will happen. Every indication shows that it will.
Okay, that's great, guys. Well, thank you so much for shedding a bit more light on Kolomoisky and his activities and what the US is doing to push back against him. On the topic of sanctions, the other big news from the past week was the reimposition of sanctions on the Israeli billionaire Dan Gertler, who is accused of massive corruption involving the Democratic Republic of Congo, very cozy relations with the former leader Joseph Kabila, who was placed under global Magnitsky sanctions by the Trump administration, then, as Marshall Billingsley explained last week, was inexplicably and somewhat appallingly removed from the sanctions regime for no apparent reason at the last minute before the end of Trump's term. Something that no one can make head or tail of, as far as I can tell. Guys, I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that. I mean, it's being presented as, you know, a good step by the Biden team. But what is the potential harm, I guess, for sanctions having been lifted on Gertler for that period of time? Either of you can jump in there.
I mean, it's not good. You know, I mean, I think that there is a lot of worry that, you know, when you get a license like that, you can move your assets around, right? I mean, and you can move them out. And I think that there's a pretty good chance that things we had frozen of Gertler's, and there was probably quite a bit of that, because in the original, remember, Gertler was sanctioned in the original global Magnitsky package, the first ever. And it was one of these like really extraordinary things when, you know, global Magnitsky is a permissive authority. You know, I mean, like, of course, if the administration weren't enforcing it, you know, we in Congress would be holding their feet to the fire. But in fact, they do enforce, and they enforce it pretty aggressively. You know, and it's a pretty, that first package was like, wow. You know, so I think that a lot of people were caught by surprise just how powerful that was. And when you catch them by surprise, remember, you can actually freeze their assets. The problem is when people know it's coming, they move everything around, it goes all over the place, and then it's gone, and then we're not able to freeze their assets, and it becomes like kind of a moral solidarity thing, you know, which is, I'm not saying that sanctions aren't important for that reason or important for behavioral change reasons, all sorts of reasons, but if you want to freeze the assets, which is really, really, really nice, then you got to get them like that. Now, when you get a license like that, Gertler knows what's up. Gertler knows his days are numbered, right? I mean, I really think that, like, you know, it'd be hard for him and the lawyers surrounding him to not know that this license was temporary. And I really,
and they presumably would have been ready to go with moving those assets the second they were effectively unfrozen. So they probably all vanished into thin air now.
That's right. So while it is very, very good that has been reinstated, and it is a credit to the administration that has been reinstated, it is also very problematic that it ever happened, and the damage is to some extent likely done. Now, can you save the credibility of the global Magnitsky program? Yes, absolutely. Like I think that this definitely saves face, but for the purposes of freezing Dan Gertler's assets, ensuring that he cannot, you know, engage in the horrible corruption that he was engaging in the Congo and elsewhere, exploiting all of these people and generating so many victims of kleptocracy, that is much harder now. That is much, much harder. And the damage is done there.
Yeah, to Paul's point, I mean, the damage that we have seen, or that we will see from this decision, this late decision from the former administration, is only going to be something that comes to fruition in coming years. And I think maybe the most unnerving or concerning element of it on my end is that the example that this sets for other figures that have been sanctioned by GloMag, for other figures that have received, a comparable reprimand from the American government or from other jurisdictions elsewhere, comparable oligarchic figures that all of a sudden can look to Gertler and say, what did he do? How did he do it? Who did he do it with? Look how successful he was. Even if it was just for the week or the final 2 weeks that he was able to receive this license. You don't need that much time in order to move that kind of assets, especially if you know this is coming down the pipe. So this was certainly a shot across the bow about the, frankly, the sanctity of things like Gold Magnitsky and the airtight elements of these sanctions packages. If Gertler could do it, this is going to give hope to other comparable figures out there that something similar could be done. We still need to get to the bottom of just exactly how this happened. Obviously, it's wonderful that the current administration restored these sanctions. It was low-hanging fruit. It absolutely had to be done. But we still need to figure out why this was allowed to take place so that it can never happen again.
Yeah, and as Marshall Billingsley said last week, I think he hinted that he would be very surprised if this had followed the usual interagency process where all parts of the US government give their input. It sounds like it was something that happened in a very rushed way on the way out. And as you say, Casey, I'm sure there's a lot of lawyers and lobbyists who are getting calls from their kleptocratic clients over the past few weeks. Can you do this for me, please? But that's about all we've got time for this week. So thanks, guys, and I look forward to chatting with you again in a couple of weeks' time.
Thanks, Nate.
Well, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed Making a Killing, please subscribe and give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, and please do share with your friends. If you have any questions, or if you're interested in learning more about this issue of global kleptocracy, please visit hudson.org to look at the work of the Kleptocracy Initiative. I'll see you next time.